Let me tell you about the biggest miscalculation in modern economic history. And I'm not talking about some minor policy error that gets corrected in a few months. I'm talking about a strategic blunder so massive, so fundamentally flawed, that future economists will study it as a textbook case of what happens when you overestimate your power and underestimate your opponent's ability to adapt. Right now, as you're watching this, the consequences of this miscalculation are spreading through the global economy, like cracks in a dam, and most people have no idea it's happening. They're being told one story by politicians and media outlets, while the actual data tells a completely different, far more alarming story. Here's what makes this situation genuinely terrifying. The architects of this strategy, the people who designed and implemented what was supposed to be an unstoppable economic weapon, they're not admitting failure. They're not changing course. Instead, they're doubling down, layering on more pressure, adding more restrictions, convinced that if they just push harder, reality will eventually bend to their will. It won't. And the longer this continues, the worse the fallout becomes for ordinary people like you and me, who had nothing to do with these decisions, but will absolutely pay the price through higher costs, economic instability, and a financial system that's being rewired in ways that will disadvantage us for decades. I'm going to walk you through three catastrophic failures that are unfolding simultaneously. Not in some distant future, not as hypothetical scenarios, but right now, today, this moment. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why your grocery bills, your energy costs, your housing expenses, everything is about to get significantly more expensive, regardless of what any politician promises you about inflation coming down or the economy recovering. More importantly, you'll see the actual mechanisms driving these changes, which means you can prepare instead of being caught completely off guard, like most people will be. So let's start with a question that should genuinely disturb you. What happens when the world's most powerful economic alliance, countries with unlimited intelligence resources, decades of financial expertise, and complete control over the global banking system, launches the most comprehensive economic attack in human history against a major economy? And 3 years later, that economy hasn't collapsed. It hasn't even come close to collapsing. In fact, it's showing clear signs of structural adaptation and resilience. Your first instinct is probably to think, I'm exaggerating. Surely the sanctions are working. We just can't see the full effects yet. The collapse is coming. It's inevitable. It's just taking longer than expected. That's exactly what we've been told for 3 straight years. Any day now, any week now. The currency will implode, the banks will fail, social unrest will force political change, economic devastation is right around the corner, except none of that happened. And the longer we pretend, it's about to happen. The more we miss what's actually occurring, which is far more complex and honestly far more concerning than a simple economic collapse would be. Let me show you some numbers, because numbers don't lie and they don't care about political narratives or propaganda from any side. Russian oil exports right now are moving at over 4 million barrels per day. Pause and think about that for a second. We're 3 years into what was marketed as the most devastating, most comprehensive, most coordinated sanctions regime ever assembled. Every major Western economy participating, thousands of pages of legal restrictions, entire government departments dedicated to enforcement, billions spent on monitoring and compliance, and yet oil is flowing at the highest levels we've seen in 3 years. That's not what success looks like. That's not what economic pressure is supposed to produce. That sounds like declaring victory while actually losing the war. But here's where the story gets truly fascinating and where the real dynamics reveal themselves if you're willing to look past the surface level analysis. Yes, Russian oil sells at a discount, about $27 below global benchmark prices. And if you stop there, if that's the extent of your analysis, you'd conclude mission accomplished, sanctions working, Russia losing money, everything according to plan. But that's not even close to the full picture. That's barely the beginning. Follow that oil on its actual journey through the global system. It leaves Russian ports at that $27 discount. Massive. Revenue hit, right? But then something remarkable happens. That exact same oil arrives in India, and suddenly, mysteriously, the discount has shrunk to just $7.50 per barrel. Where did nearly $20 per barrel go? Did it vanish into thin air? Did it evaporate during the journey? Of course not. Money doesn't disappear, it just changes hands. And this is where the entire architecture of economic warfare reveals its fundamental fatal flaw. That $20 gap is being divided among a fascinating network of players. Shadow. Fleet shipping companies operating in legal gray zones with obscured ownership. They take their cut, often substantial. Trading firms willing to handle Russian oil when Western companies won't. They extract significant margins. Insurance providers covering risks that Western insurers refuse. They get paid handsomely. But here's the detail that changes everything. Many of these shipping companies, these trading firms, these middlemen profiting enormously from this arrangement, they have direct or indirect ties back to Russia. Some are owned by Russian entities through complex corporate structures. Others are controlled by oligarchs or state-connected companies through layers of shell corporations, which means a substantial portion of that discount, the money that was supposed to be denied to Russia as punishment, actually flows right back through this ecosystem of intermediaries. What we're witnessing is economic adaptation happening at a scale and speed that clearly wasn't anticipated. The system didn't break. It evolved. It found new pathways, new routes, new methods. And those pathways are now so well established, so deeply embedded in global trade flows, that closing them would require a level of international cooperation that simply doesn't exist anymore. This brings us to India, which has become absolutely central to understanding how this system now works. India went from buying virtually no Russian oil before the conflict to becoming one of the largest purchasers globally. They're buying at a discount, refining it in their sophisticated refineries, and then selling petroleum products to markets that refuse to buy Russian crude directly. It's arbitrage on a geopolitical scale, and the profits are staggering. Conservative estimates put India's earnings from this arrangement at around $16 billion. That's not pocket change. That's not some side business. That's real wealth reshaping their entire energy sector and creating enormous fortunes for trading companies and refineries. Some of the wealthiest families in India have made billions from this trade. New companies have been created specifically to facilitate these flows. Port facilities have been expanded massively to handle the volume. This is complete economic restructuring happening in real time. And here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. This isn't temporary. This isn't going away when the conflict ends. These are permanent changes to global energy markets, new trade relationships that will persist for decades, infrastructure investments that lock in these flows for the long term. Now, let me pause here because this is critically important. What I'm presenting is analysis based on publicly available data. Trade statistics, shipping records, market reports, economic indicators. This is educational content designed to help you understand complex economic forces that directly impact your life. This is not financial advice. I'm not telling you what to invest in. I'm not making political arguments about right or wrong. I'm showing you what the actual data reveals versus what we've been told would happen. There's a massive gap between those two realities. And understanding that gap is how you make better decisions for yourself and your family. Before we go deeper, if you're finding value in this analysis, if this is connecting dots you haven't seen connected anywhere else, hit that subscribe button right now. I spend weeks researching these topics, digging through data that mainstream coverage completely ignores. Subscribing helps more people discover this perspective and tells me this matters to you. The oil situation reveals something profound about power in the modern world. In a truly unipolar system where one power dominates completely, economic weapons work because there are no alternatives. You either comply or you're completely cut off. But we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a multipolar system where alternatives exist, where other major powers are willing to absorb trade that Western countries refuse, where new logistics networks can be built surprisingly quickly, where financial infrastructure can route around blockages. In this world, sanctions don't stop activity. They redirect it. They create winners and losers in unexpected places. India wins enormously. Shipping companies win. Trading firms win. Russia loses some revenue, but nowhere near the catastrophic losses that were intended. They've adapted, restructured, and found new markets. And every single month that passes, these new trade routes become more established, more efficient, more permanent. But oil is only the first pillar of this economic pressure campaign. The second pillar was supposed to be currency warfare. And this is where things become truly counterintuitive, where the results are so opposite of what was intended that you'd almost think someone made a deliberate mistake. The stated goal was explicit: reduce the ruble to rubble. Those were the actual words used by officials. The strategy was to make Russian currency worthless, trigger hyperinflation, cause bank runs, create financial panic so severe that domestic populations would demand immediate political change. Currency collapse has toppled governments before. It's destroyed economies and sparked revolutions. So the theory was sound based on historical precedent. What actually happened is going to sound impossible if you've only been following mainstream coverage. The ruble has strengthened by 45% against the dollar year to date. Not weakened, not collapsed, strengthened by 45%. If you looked at a chart of ruble performance without any context, you would naturally assume sanctions had been lifted, that trade had normalized, that everything was back to normal. Now, before you jump to conclusions, let me explain why this is happening and why it's more complex than either sanctions failed completely or sanctions worked perfectly. First, the obvious question. Isn't a stronger currency bad for an export-dependent economy? In theory, yes. When your currency appreciates, exports become more expensive for foreign buyers. You should sell less. For most commodity exporters, this would be fatal. But Russia's situation has specific characteristics that change the calculation entirely. The primary export, energy, is already selling at a substantial discount. That $27 discount we discussed. When you're offering oil significantly below market rates, buyers aren't particularly sensitive to currency movements. They're still getting a deal compared to Saudi or American oil. The theoretical disadvantage of currency strength, reduced export competitiveness, is largely offset by the massive discount already in place. But the advantages of a stronger ruble are very real and substantial. First, imports become cheaper. Industrial inputs, raw materials, components needed for manufacturing all become more affordable. This is the foundation of economic development. Second, inflation control. When your currency is strong, imported goods don't spike in price. For a population dealing with massive uncertainty, price stability is crucial for maintaining social cohesion. Third, and this is geopolitically fascinating, a stronger ruble improves terms of trade with your biggest partner. And who is Russia's largest trading partner? China. Russia actually runs a trade surplus with China. They sell more than they buy. When the ruble strengthens, Russia exchanges fewer rubles for more Chinese yuan. They get better purchasing power for the industrial products their economy desperately needs. This creates a reinforcing cycle. As trade shifts away from dollars and euros toward rubles and yuan, demand for Western currencies inside Russia drops. Lower demand means those currencies become relatively less valuable compared to the ruble. The ruble strengthens further. Stronger ruble makes Chinese imports more attractive. More trade happens in local currencies. The cycle continues. Look at what Russia is actually importing from China. This isn't luxury goods or consumer electronics. We're talking machinery, vehicles, industrial equipment. This is the infrastructure of economic development. This is how you build an economy that doesn't depend entirely on commodity exports. Here's another data point that destroys the collapse narrative. Oil and gas revenue now represents only 30% of Russia's federal budget. Compare that to 2014 when it was around 50%. The economy is diversifying out of necessity. Sanctions are forcing development of domestic manufacturing, expansion of technology sectors, growth in agriculture, and building service industries. This is literally the opposite of what economic warfare is supposed to achieve. Instead of creating crisis, the pressure is incentivizing exactly the kind of structural reforms that make a country more resilient and self-sufficient long-term. You're not weakening the economy, you're forcing it to evolve and adapt. Now, I need to emphasize something. I'm not making moral arguments. I'm not saying these policies are good or bad ethically. What I am saying is, if we evaluate these measures purely on whether they're achieving their stated objectives, the evidence strongly suggests they're not. And more critically, they may be producing unintended consequences that will reshape global economics for decades in ways that disadvantage ordinary people in Western countries. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment below, tell me what you think. Do economic sanctions still work in a multipolar world? Can financial weapons force compliance when alternatives exist? Your perspective genuinely matters and helps me understand what resonates and what to explore in future videos. The currency situation reveals something fundamental. In a world where multiple major economies trade outside the dollar system, where alternative payment networks have been built specifically to avoid Western financial infrastructure, currency-based sanctions lose much of their power. The ruble's strength isn't just about central bank policy. It's evidence of a broader structural shift in how international trade is conducted. This brings us to the third crisis, the one that I believe will define the next few years and possibly reshape the global economy more than anything we've discussed so far. This one is just beginning, but the warning signs are everywhere if you know where to look. We're heading into what could be the most consequential commodity war in modern history, and it's centered on copper. You might have heard about silver. Physical silver demand in China has been so intense that prices there are trading 10% above global markets. That's not normal. That's either panic buying or strategic stockpiling on a massive scale. But silver was just the opening move. The real battle is copper, and the implications are staggering. Copper prices in China just hit record levels. Prices jumped nearly 5% in single trading sessions. Supply markets are even tighter, with prices climbing over 5.5%. These aren't normal market fluctuations. This is confirmation that a full-scale commodity war is unfolding right now. Why copper? Why is this metal suddenly at the center of great power competition? Because copper is genuinely irreplaceable in modern civilization. You cannot build infrastructure without it. You cannot manufacture electronics without it. You cannot construct power grids without it. You cannot build electric vehicles without it. And most critically, you cannot build data centers without massive amounts of it. Right now, both the United States and China have simultaneously decided that securing copper supply is a matter of national economic security. When the world's two largest economies, with essentially unlimited resources, compete for a finite commodity, what happens to prices? They don't just increase, they explode, and everyone else gets caught in the crossfire. Let me walk you through how this is unfolding. China has explicitly made domestic economic growth their number one priority. That's actual policy, not rhetoric. Growth means infrastructure spending, construction, industrial activity, all of which requires enormous copper consumption. The United States is quietly but aggressively stockpiling copper while backing major domestic production projects. The U.S. government is supporting a $7.4 billion smelter project. That's not a small investment. That's a strategic initiative to build domestic supply chains independent of potential adversaries. Now here's what makes this urgent and frankly scary for everyday people. Data centers. The AI boom isn't slowing down. Hundreds of billions are being committed to AI infrastructure by every major tech company. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta, all racing to build computing capacity. Where does that capital go? Into physical data centers, buildings full of servers, cooling systems, power distribution. And what do data centers require in enormous quantities? Steel for structure, aluminum for components, and especially copper. Copper for wiring, power distribution, cooling systems. Projections suggest data center construction alone could increase global copper demand by 500,000 tons annually by 2030. That's just data centers. Doesn't include electric vehicles, grid modernization, or normal construction. Think about the mathematics. Global copper supply is already tight. There's not much slack in the system. Now add surging demand from two economic superpowers simultaneously. Add the fact that neither wants to depend on the other. Add that both see technological supremacy as existential to their future power. Add one more factor. Building new copper mines takes years, often a decade from discovery to production. What do you get? A supply crunch that will ripple through every sector of the global economy, and most people have no idea it's coming. Here's where geopolitics and economics merge completely. The countries with largest copper reserves are primarily South America. Chile and Peru together account for about 7.6 million tons annually. That's the majority of global supply. Two countries. Suddenly, foreign policy toward Latin America makes a lot more sense when you understand the resource dimension. This isn't just about ideology or democracy promotion. It's about securing access to commodities absolutely critical for technological development. Whoever controls or has reliable access to South American copper has a massive strategic advantage. But here's where it gets more interesting. China currently dominates refining. They control approximately 50% of global copper refining capacity. Think about what that means. Half of all copper produced anywhere has to pass through Chinese facilities at some point. That's not just market share. That's leverage. That's power. The United States is behind in this race, and they know it. They're trying to catch up, but catching up in heavy industry takes time and enormous capital. Recent tariff structures reveal the strategy clearly. High tariffs on finished copper products to make imports expensive, but raw copper ore, that's tariff-free. The message is clear. America wants raw materials flowing in so they can build domestic refining capacity. They're willing to pay premiums to reshore this critical supply chain. China sees this in real time, and they're responding just as aggressively. They recently spent over $1 billion to acquire a major copper project, reportedly paying a 40% premium over market value. They're deliberately overpaying. Why? Because at this level of strategic competition, securing long-term supply is worth more than short-term financial returns. This is strategic resource competition at the highest level. Both sides are signaling they will spend whatever it takes, pay whatever premiums are necessary to secure copper supply. So what does this mean for you personally? Higher inflation is coming. Not maybe, not possibly, it's coming. The cost of building anything will increase substantially. Housing, already unaffordable for massive portions of the population, will get worse. Construction costs will rise. Manufacturing costs will rise across the board. And all those costs get passed to consumers eventually. If you thought inflation in 2021, 2022 was painful, and it absolutely was, the commodity-driven inflation potentially coming could actually be worse in certain sectors. It might not show up in overall statistics the same way, but in construction, electronics, anything requiring significant copper input, prices will climb. And here's the difficult part. Neither the US nor China can back down. It's not optional. Both governments see technological leadership, particularly in AI and advanced manufacturing, as essential to their future. Copper is the physical infrastructure that makes all that technology possible. Without secure copper supply, you cannot build the future both countries envision, so both will keep buying, keep building, keep securing supply regardless of cost. They'll outbid each other. They'll pay premiums. They'll offer political concessions to supplier countries. And everyone else, all the smaller economies, all the everyday consumers, will pay the price through higher costs for everything containing copper. This is also why the US dollar will continue facing structural pressure. The government is going to spend enormous amounts securing these supply chains. That spending comes from somewhere. Deficit spending, Money creation, expanding the money supply, that's dollar debasement by definition. US Treasury bonds, supposed to be the safest asset in the world, the foundation of global finance, the mathematics start looking questionable when you factor in spending commitments being made. I'm not saying bonds will collapse or the dollar will disappear, but the assumption they're automatically risk-free, automatically the best store of value, that assumption is worth questioning. Before we wrap up, if this analysis gave you perspective you haven't seen elsewhere, if it connected dots you didn't know were there, please hit that like button and consider sharing this video. This deep research takes significant time. Your engagement helps more people discover this information and tells me this approach resonates. Let me bring all three stories together because they're not separate phenomena. They're part of one larger transformation most people don't see happening. We're watching the end of unipolar economic dominance. For roughly 30 years after the Cold War, the United States and allies could use financial tools as weapons with reliable effectiveness. Sanctions usually worked. Currency pressure usually created intended crises. Market access denial usually forced compliance. That era is ending. Not because America is weaker in absolute terms, but because the relative balance has shifted. Alternative systems now exist. China has built parallel financial infrastructure designed to operate independently of Western systems. Major economies have diversified trade relationships and reduced dependence on any single partner. Strategic stockpiles have been built, alternative currency arrangements established. When you try to use economic weapons in this new environment, they don't work the same way. Sanctions that would have crippled a country in 1995 now just redirect trade flows. Currency pressure that would have created catastrophic crises in 2005 now accelerates the move away from dollar dependence. The tools aren't useless. They still have impact. But they're significantly less powerful than they used to be. And sometimes they produce counterproductive results. That's not a political statement. That's objective analysis of what data shows. For you as an individual trying to navigate this environment, this matters enormously because it shapes the economic landscape you'll deal with for years to come. Higher commodity prices flowing to higher consumer costs, currency instability affecting import prices and investment returns, shifting trade patterns, changing which economies grow and which stagnate. The old rules, the assumptions that guided financial planning for 30 years, those aren't reliable anymore. New rules are being written in real time through exactly these conflicts and competitions. The people who understand this transition, who see these patterns developing early, will make fundamentally better financial decisions than those who assume the world still works the way it did 20 years ago. So let me ask you directly, is the Russian economy collapsing or adapting? Based on the data we've examined, exports, currency strength, economic diversification, it looks like adaptation to me. Is that good or bad? That depends entirely on your values, your political perspective, your priorities. I'm not here to tell you what to think about that. But I am here to show you what's actually happening versus what we're told is happening. Because that gap between perception and reality is where the most important insights live. Who will win the copper war between the US and China? Honestly, probably nobody wins in the traditional sense. Both will end up paying far more than they wanted. Both will make strategic compromises they'd prefer to avoid. Consumers in both countries and around the world will face higher prices for years. But in relative terms, whoever builds the more resilient, diversified, secure supply chain first will have significant advantage in technological development that defines the next decade. The bigger picture is about adaptability versus rigidity. Economic systems that can adapt, find new pathways when old ones are blocked, innovate under pressure, those systems survive and sometimes thrive. Systems that rely on old playbooks, assume past dominance guarantees future dominance, can't adjust when conditions change, those face the hardest adjustments and most painful transitions. We're living through one of those rare historical moments when economic order is actually changing in fundamental ways. Most people won't realize this transition was happening until they look back in 5 or 10 years and see the turning point clearly in retrospect. But you're seeing it happen right now in real time. The question is what you do with that information. How does it change your understanding of where to invest, what skills to develop, what risks to prepare for? Those are deeply individual decisions depending on your specific circumstances, but they should be informed by accurate analysis of what's actually occurring rather than comfortable narratives that don't match reality. The coming years will be volatile. Commodity prices will likely surge in multiple categories. Currency markets will remain unstable. Trade patterns will keep shifting as countries adapt to new realities. None of that is comfortable or easy. But volatility also creates opportunity for those who are prepared. Stay informed. Stay skeptical of overly simple narratives from any source. Follow actual data rather than stories people tell about data. Understand that economic warfare in a multipolar world produces complex, often counterintuitive results. And most importantly, recognize we're not going back to the old system. That world is gone. Forward is the only direction available. And the new system emerging will look fundamentally different from what we've known. I really appreciate you sticking with me through this detailed exploration. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of engaged, curious viewer that makes creating this content worthwhile. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Stay safe out there. Keep learning. Keep questioning what you're told. Keep looking at actual data. And remember, understanding these macro trends, seeing big patterns before they become obvious to everyone, that's how you make better decisions about your own life and finances. Until next time.